West. I'm a managing director at CareWorks Tech, or a technology consulting company, and I joined to start a security line of business. I also have the pleasure of wearing another hat, which is CISO for our parent company, York Risk Services. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how to present to the board, understand what they're doing.
VGA?
What's that?
Do you have VGA?
I don't.
Oh. No, it won't work. Just keep going with what you...
No, we're good. We're good. We're good. We're good. We're fine. So there may be some technical details, but if you can see the presentation, you can hear me, then I think we're all good. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is help you understand what the role of a board member is, look at some historical issues, look what CISO Nirvana is like, and take a look at, what are board members thinking, how do they function, what are the principles. And I think one of the most important things in security leadership is to help the board members understand how they should be doing their job and what questions they should be asking. So hopefully towards the end of this, we'll have some time for Q&A, and please feel free to interrupt me as we're going along. Happy to answer some questions in real time. One of the things I'm going to reference is the Target breach, which I think has been the poster child of the decade, but I think there's actually some very good lessons to be learned there. So as a starting point, I'm going to go on this crazy assumption that you can read, and apologize for all the verbiage, but at the end of the day, one of the responsibilities that board members have is to make sure that the right controls are in place, not just security, but general controls across the board, from financial controls, strategy roles, just really across the organization. And this is verbiage from a report called What the Board of Directors Need to Ask from the Institute of Internal Auditors. So one of the key things that you need to understand is this is the counsel that they're getting from major organizations, and this is pretty consistent. You'll see some similar things from the National Association of Corporate Directors as well. But at the end of the day, the other key point on this slide is that the directors shouldn't be relegating the responsibility to the technology organization. This isn't a technology problem, right? I mean, what happens if information is stolen, whether it's strategy information, customer information? There's a lot of reputational risks that can be present. You can have financial loss. There's at the end of the day, board members are held responsible, so they can go to jail if they're not providing proper oversight. I think, going back to Target, I think it's a really interesting case study, because when you look at what happened going at the highest levels, there's a group called Institutional Shareholder Services, an independent shareholder group that recommended that 7 of the board members not be reelected because they weren't providing proper oversight. The CEO is gone, more than likely because they weren't performing well in Canada, but I think this was a dual-purpose move. CIO is gone. They didn't have a CISO at the time, and thankfully they hired Brad Maiorino, who's a very capable guy, and he's made significant strides in their organization. But the point being, if I were a public company board member, I'd be paying attention to that, right? And that drives me to ask some good questions. And some of the historical issues, looking at things on the security side, is, so where does security report? So a lot of times, senior security leaders, CISOs, CSOs, have been buried in the technology organization, or they might report to the CIO. And one of the things is that there's a clear distinction between the CIO's mission and the CISO's mission. So the CIO is there to deliver technology solutions to the business. The CISO's mission is to keep the environment safe. And you can get past that with proper governance, right? I mean, you have to have a good dialogue going on across the organization. But all things being equal, there's a disconnect in terms of reporting structure. And you can make it work, though. Security has also been perceived as the business prevention unit, right? It's the guys and gals that say no, as opposed to partnering with the business and understanding, where are you heading? What types of solutions can I bring to the table to get you there? And one of the things that I still hear regularly is that, I don't have visibility with the board or the executive team and they don't understand what I'm saying. And my response is, number one, they shouldn't understand your language. It's your responsibility to put it into terms that they understand, right? So how does security impact my legal risk? How does it impact my regulatory posture? How does it impact my top or bottom line? And those are the types of conversations that you need to be having. And then historically also you have this black magic thing, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, all is good in security without being transparent. And one of the things that most people need to understand that are in that position is when you take a look at an organization across the board, there are pretty clear metrics in terms of how an organization functions. They're either working well or not. So you have clarity around how a CFO functions, how a general counsel functions, how the business, are they making money or not? Are they meeting their objectives? And I think the final thing that I still hear, although not as much as I used to, I've had a couple conversations in the last 6 months where a couple CISOs have told me that one of their responsibilities is to prevent breaches from happening. And I think of it similar to, think of a general counsel going into a board meeting or an executive committee meeting saying they can prevent lawsuits from happening, right? Probably not a whole lot of credibility after that statement is made. And I think that there is a really strong analogy there. So flip side is, for CISOs to do their job well, they need to communicate business value. They need to understand that one of the things that's most important to the business is managing their brand and reputation. So think of going back to the Target breach. There were a bit over 100 million consumer credit card records that were stolen. And for example, Chase had to reissue 2 million cards. And they had no control of the situation, right? They were a victim of the situation. But it's a real impact to them. And I personally know 3 people whose checking accounts were drained because of the Target breach. They got their money back, but it's a pain in the posterior. And that JP Morgan Chase's general counsel was on the phone with Target's general counsel. Let's have a little chat, right? And you think of the fallout going since that point. Sometime in the last 6 months, there was clearance that a class action lawsuit from the banks was allowed to go forward. There was $1 billion lawsuit in Canada, and they won't settle for $1 billion. It'll end up being less than that. But there's financial costs, there's reputational costs, not just for Target, but for anyone that's in the ecosystem. So again, going back to how does security get translated into business value, right? I mean, how can I deliver better products more securely? So, for example, both in our parent company and with companies that I've consulted to or we're consulting with, a lot of times, particularly in the B2B group, there'll be proposals that are being responded to, and consistently some of the questions that are being asked is, how are you protecting information? Right, and if you can tell a good story that says, I'm doing a reasonable job, then chances are that you're going to get additional business. So I think of it, if you're familiar with manufacturing and ISO 9000, if you're buying a product from someone that's 9001 certified, it means they have the right controls in place, there's predictable quality, and you're probably going to get a good product. So if I'm considering buying a product from someone, one company is ISO 9001 certified, the other one isn't, price is the same, that's a pretty easy decision to make. And so using ISO 27001 as a reference model ends up being something that's of significant benefit, or the NIST cybersecurity framework. I think that the CISO should function a lot like a general counsel. And if you think of what a general counsel's responsibility is, it's to coach the business on what legal risk exists and what's reasonable to accept. But the general counsel never accepts the risk for the organization. It's the line of business. And in a similar context, the CISO should be doing the same thing. And particularly as it relates to the board, the CISO should be coaching the board in terms of what's meaningful and what makes sense to accept in terms of risk. Going back to metrics, when you start talking to the board about metrics, they, and the executive team for that matter, they don't care about, how many viruses that you're blocking, right? I mean, how many attacks you've stopped. The general conversation is, are you doing what's reasonable? What's commercially reasonable? And I'll get into that a little bit more. And finally, on this slide, just taking a comprehensive approach to making sure that you protect information consistently across an organization. And that's really one of the biggest challenges is doing it systemically. But the good news is if you use a consistent approach like NIST or ISO as a reference model and you execute against that, then chances are you're going to get there more often than not. So when you start talking about, what are the guiding principles for the board as it relates to oversight over how information is protected within their organizations? So they need to understand that there's an enterprise-wide approach that's taken, and most organizations have enterprise risk management organizations, and in general they do a good job in terms of understanding economic risk, financial risk, geopolitical risk, credit risk. But in most organizations, technology risk isn't part of that equation. And so getting a perspective that says, this is one of the things that allows us to manage risk across the enterprise is not only something that allows you to do it consistently, but it's language that the board is going to understand. The directors also need to understand, so what are the legal implications of protecting information properly or not? Going back to Target, I was talking about the number of legal actions that are taken against Target. So, and there can be multiple, right? So in the United States, just alone, I think there's 50 state security breach laws that exist now, and there's been national laws that have been under consideration for some time. But given the political climate, I would expect we're not going to get there in the near term. But that's one of the things that from a legal perspective, what do I do as an organization, when a breach happens? And bottom line is you need to be prepared. The boards need to have consistent access to someone that really understands the cybersecurity world. It can be someone within the organization, it can be someone externally, but at the end of the day, they need to understand, so what are the right questions to ask as a board member, and how can I understand if the organization is doing the right things? They need to understand that the executive team is taking an enterprise-wide approach to protecting information, and that the right budget is there, and the right staffing level is there. So going back to, so what are the questions that the board is going to be asking? At the end of the day, if you're communicating with them properly and they understand what you're saying and they understand the problems you're dealing with, then they'll get it, and you'll probably get the right level of funding and staff to do your job properly. And the final bullet on here is, once they really understand the state of affairs, they'll be presented with, so what are the burning issues of the day? What do I need to address as an organization? And then they can make some decisions in terms of, this is something that needs to be addressed, or I may transfer risk through insurance. There are multiple ways to address risk in an organization, but really understanding, so what are the top issues that I need to be addressing is fundamental. So the Institute of Internal Auditors has 6 questions that they pose to board members that they should be asking of their organizations. So the first one is, does the organization use a security framework? So I was mentioning ISO, and the NIST cybersecurity framework is also another one. The bottom line is pick one. You use something that's comprehensive. And the good news is whether it's ISO or NIST, there tends to be a good mapping in either direction. What I see is that most companies that operate internationally will tend to use ISO because there's a certain number of countries that have the perception, if it was built in the United States, it's evil, maybe not necessarily to that extreme. So NIST comes out of the U.S. government, and it's actually quite reasonable. But ISO is done in a relatively neutral way. It has international participation. So, one of the important messages that needs to be sent to the board is that, breaches are going to happen, right? I mean, you can't prevent them all. You can minimize the damage if you have the right visibility and the right controls in place. But when they happen, sooner or later, you're going to go to court. And when you go to court, if you can say that I have a consistent approach, it's commercially reasonable, it's an internationally accepted standard, then the settlement and the amount of litigation that goes on is going to go down. And then obviously there's some industry-specific requirements that you have to meet, right? I mean, there's HIPAA and high trust in healthcare. There's PCI for if you have financial transactions, credit card transactions that occur. There's specific ones. All of this generally maps back to ISO. I mean, there are some industry-specific ISO frameworks, but ISO 27000 is comprehensive across the board. And it starts at governance, goes down to policies, and you have to do this crazy thing and tell people about that policies exist. And at the end of the day, it's a soup to nuts approach. So the next question that the Institute of Internal Auditors poses for board members that they should be asking, what are the top risks the organizations have as it relates to cybersecurity? And right now we're going through this fundamental transformation from a technology perspective. So most organizations have either gone to the cloud or are in the process of going there. You have the bring your own disaster. I mean, bring your own device phenomenon that goes along. And the basic notion is most organizations either think, so here's my network, right? Inside is good, outside is bad. And the reality is that hasn't been relevant for 15 years for sure. So you need to be looking at things in terms of, what are my assets, right? I mean, what's the value of my assets? And then you need to understand where they sit and then make some decisions in terms of how I protect them. But whether it's within your infrastructure, the cloud, or on devices, you have to have a strategic approach to protecting information. Outsourcing has been part of doing business for quite some time, whether it's traditional outsourcing or offshore outsourcing. And whether you outsource or not, it doesn't matter. You're still responsible for protecting your client information, strategic information. It doesn't absolve you of that responsibility. And you also have to understand that, natural disasters will happen. I remember back in 2008 when the latest round of hurricanes were hitting New Orleans and the South. Ohio sent a lot of electric sector workers to be prepared to address the hurricane as it landed. And what no one understood was that the winds from the hurricane were going to hit the Midwest. So we had sustained winds of 70 to 80 miles an hour. I think it was over a 48-hour period. And Ohio had outages up to about 10 days, and it was gradually contained. But I remember there were several Fortune 500 companies in Ohio that were simply shut down. They didn't have business continuity plans in place, and as a consequence, some drilling is happening. Speaking of interesting, we're just going to have to deal with this. So speaking of unplanned events, so you need to plan for things like that, or disasters, or cutting of electrical power, or whatever it happens to be. We're just going to tap dance and see where it goes. So you need to be prepared. How often are you looking at access reviews? So who has access to what, and when they get in, what do they have access to? Yeah, stop it. They're not listening to me. So then it's either that or a very eager dentist. So then you have advanced persistent threats, and I think this is one thing that most organizations don't pay enough attention to. So you have things like China as a nation state that has had a really persistent effort in terms of stealing intellectual property over the last 15, 20 years. So what does it mean to me if my customer list is stolen? Right? I mean, what if my intellectual property is stolen? How does that impact me as a business? And that's the conversation, or certainly one of the conversations that need to be had. How are employees and business partners made aware of what they need to be doing on a day-to-day basis for protecting information? And similar to taking a strategic approach in protecting information, this is something that cascades down from the board. So if the board thinks this is a priority, then the executive team is going to deem it a priority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In one of the companies that I worked in, we had a challenge and I'm going to make a long-winded point here. So one of the things that we did is, so many people did not wear their access badges and display them, which was corporate policy. And we played a little game during an awareness week, and it was spot the executive that isn't wearing their badge. And ultimately, whoever challenged the executive got $100. The executive was carrying $100, and people didn't catch on early. But I think it was by day 2, someone finally challenged the executive. And after that, people really understood, hey, you know, I need to challenge my organization because I may or may not know everyone that comes in and out of my building. But the point being is that you need to challenge an organization and go up the food chain and make sure that they understand it's important. So, you know, for example, if a CEO decides that I'm not going to wear my badge, his or her direct reports are going to pay attention to that. And, well, you know, if the CEO doesn't wear their badge, then why should I, right? Or if they don't remember their passwords, or, you know, whatever the behavior is, it's a tone at the top mentality. You know, then you have all these positions that have significant impact on protecting information. So you have application developers, for example, or you have project managers, people that are managing infrastructure. There's some very focused awareness and education that needs to happen to make sure that they're protecting information. And you know, I think just even focusing on developers for a second, you know, most people when they go through college, they're never taught how to code securely. And so what happens, you know, if you as an organization don't take responsibility and educate them, they start writing code, and in most cases it's going to have a lot of security vulnerabilities, and it's not their fault, it's just they haven't been taught. So part of it is, you know, if you can reduce the number of application security risks, it goes a really long way in integrating that into the development life cycle, whether it's traditional SDLC or Agile or DevOps, becomes something that brings a lot of value to the organization. So the board is going to care about things like that. So what are the threats that I'm exposed to as an organization? You know, again, going back to the model of inside is good, outside is bad. There are a lot of organizations that don't pay attention to insider threats. So when you think of things historically, you know, SocGen had a trader, I think it was in 2007, that lost $7 billion of their money because he was a rogue trader. And what happened was, you know, he joined in a role that was in compliance, moved into research, moved to trading, and along the way he retained the access to all the system that he had all through his journey. And if they had understood that I needed to control and take away access from his previous positions, a lot of the damage would have been eliminated. Or if there had been some limits in terms of, you know, I can make a trade that goes to this level, but once it's this large, then I need to have someone else validate that the trade makes sense. You know, those are types of things that as CISOs, as security organizations, can be impacted in a very positive way. But at the end of the day, you really need to be asking a question as a board member. So, you know, what are the risks for the organization? What's the likelihood of bad things happening? And the things that are most likely are the things that I want to address. You know, one of the foundational things within security organizations is having the proper governance. And again, I think this is one of the common mistakes. I think most CISOs still don't appreciate that managing relationships and making sure that there's an enterprise-wide conversation going on, that's going to solve a whole bunch of different issues on a day-to-day basis, and getting validation that my strategic approach at a fundamental level aligns with both business and technology strategy. So you have this dynamic in many cases where, you know, the security group is feuding with the network group or the developers, right? If you have a strategic direction set for the organization and everyone at the right level of the executive team agrees on a particular direction, those conversations can be addressed much more easily. So if you define, you know, what my policies are, right? I mean, for example, if I'm developing, I should only be developing in a in a development environment, and then move things to test and then into production. There's a lot of organizations that I still see that will do development in production, for example, but it's probably not a good practice. So at any rate, if you've agreed as an organization that that's the right security hygiene to follow, and there's proper governance through the organization, if there's a disagreement, then you can just funnel it up through the organization, and because it's one thing to listen to Bob as CISO, right? It's another thing to listen to your boss. And generally speaking, you're going to listen to your boss more than me. So if you have the right governance and everyone at the top agrees that you're going to do development in a development environment, then you just funnel up the conversation through the organization. Ultimately, the message comes back down and says, here's how life should be, right? And you have this broad set of issues that you need to be addressing as an organization anyway, right? I mean, you have fundamental business issues. And I like to use the example. So let's say there's a new business initiative. There's a chance to make an additional $100 million in revenue, but there's a risk of losing $10 million. As a business leader, I would choose, providing that I'm not impacting the rest of the organization, I would choose to accept the risk and lose $10 million if the probability of having an additional $100 million in revenue is high enough. And number one, that's a business decision. And you as a CISO or as a senior security executive need to be there coaching the business to understand, well, if you're heading down this path, here's the ways that we can minimize the risk of losing $10 million and impacting the rest of the organization. Does that make sense? So, as I was saying, breaches are going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So how prepared am I? And so the question is, if there's a breach, has management prepared a robust response protocol? So having basic incident response plans in place and doing this crazy thing about testing them to make sure that when things go bump in the night, you're properly prepared. One of the really important things to do is make sure that the communications group is engaged, because more than likely press is going to come asking, so what happened? And if you don't have a clear, concise answer that's communicated to the outside world, it can really impact how you're perceived as an organization, right? So you think Sony, for example, in their multiple breaches, probably didn't handle it very well. And you have to have the crisis management team in a very clear way to get to the executive team and ultimately to the board if necessary. So a couple times as I've developed incident response plans for the organizations that I've led or for my clients, a lot of times you really need to understand, so what are the systemic escalation processes that exist in your organization? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to invent a one-off process, and you want to align yourself with things that already exist in the organization. So one of the decisions that we made in one of my former stomping grounds, that when security issues arose, rather than the CIO's organization leading the way, it flipped to security. And then security would make decisions in consultation with the business in terms of what decisions were made along the way to resolve the security issue. But at the end of the day, having some very clear roles and responsibilities. So who's coming to the table? When do I need to engage law enforcement? The clearer the plan, the better. And if it's rehearsed, whether you're doing tabletop exercises, and the same holds true in terms of business continuity and disaster recovery as well. So hopefully that's helpful. As I was saying, the Institute of Internal Auditors has some good materials that you can reference. You can go on the National Association of Corporate Directors website. They have some good information. And one of the publications, which I've referenced over the last 10 years or so, it's an Information Security Governance Guidance for Boards of Directors and Executive Management. It's published by the Information Technology Governance Institute, which I think still exists. It's part of ISACA. Those are really good references. I think at the end of the day, if I were to leave you with something, it's, this is a journey, and, so the good news is when you get the board's attention, you're starting a conversation, and then from that point forward, you need to make sure that you continue to engage them. So on the front end, when you have your first conversation with the board, a lot of times you have to do some education, right? I mean, this is Security 101. Here's what we're doing as an organization to protect the organization, and here's our plan. You have to be very clear in terms of communicating, so here's our gaps, but here's what I'm doing to fill the gaps, and if you have a good strategy to address that, then that's going to be well received. I was having a conversation earlier, and you don't want to overpromise to them, right? And you need to be grounded in reality when you're communicating with the board, because if you say, all is well, and it's not, sooner or later, these people aren't stupid, right? They will find out at some point. And if you're not being transparent in terms of what you're doing well and what you're not doing well, then that becomes a problem. And at the end of the day, they're there to help you, right? I mean, they're there to partner with you to make sure that things get done. And I can tell you both, I've leveraged my boards and internal audit to get things done in cases. I view them as partners. We're all on a common mission, right, to make sure the right controls are in place for organizations. So the key thing is really understanding how can I leverage that relationship to make sure that I get to the end game properly. Happy to answer any questions that you might have. Questions, comments? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so being very jaundiced, I think that the composition of the board makes a really big difference. I have a good friend of mine, Myrna Soto. She's CISO at Comcast, and she's on CMS Energy's board. So to their credit, they really understand that having someone that has expertise in cybersecurity is of value on being a full member of the board, being an external member. I think particularly given the climate that we're in, having someone as a full member of the board makes a lot of sense. In worst case, having access to someone that has very deep expertise and can help the board understand, what are the issues of the day, what do we need to be concerned with, makes a lot of sense. Jerry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was going beyond using a framework to protect things comprehensively, what else can you do to show that you're doing the right things? I think that's what your question was. What's commercially reasonable? So I think one of the things, it's one thing to understand that you have a good pulse on it, but on a regular basis, you should be bringing someone in to validate that what you're doing makes sense. I mean, a lot of times you may just not have visibility into what's happening into areas of an organization, whether it's network infrastructure, whether it's development, physical controls over buildings, and having an objective opinion from the outside periodically is going to give you some validation that what you're doing makes sense. I mean, I can always have my opinion that I'm doing the right thing, and it might be, but there may be issues in terms of execution. And I just think having a regular conversation to validate that makes an incredible amount of sense. Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So I think your question was, how do you communicate, when vulnerabilities occur across the organization? I think one of the things is you first really need to understand, so what is the vulnerability? What's its impact in my organization? And then you can make a decision in terms of what you communicate. Part of it ends up, do you have the right process existing to communicate? So if it's severe enough, do I have a good incident response plan? And do I have access to the right people that can help solve the problem? If it's happening in an outsourced environment, for example, do I have the right contacts so I can pick up the phone, shoot an email off, and have the problem addressed? A lot of it really becomes judgment in terms of, this could be a showstopper for us, right? Or it could be something minor. So first of all is using your own judgment and having a measuring stick to understand, is it a really high risk that I need to address right now, or is it just noise that I can get to later? And hopefully I answered your question. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So let me just capture what you said. I think a lot of times there's an expectation that it's a technology issue. It's going to be handled by the security and technology geeks, right, as opposed to it being a business issue. So I think, fundamentally having the right governance and the right enterprise conversation going on to begin with is a starting point in addressing that. Because, if we agree on the rules of the road, number one, and when people should be engaged to address an issue, that solves a lot of the problem. And having the right sponsors. So for example, in my particular case, I have an active dialogue with the CEO of my parent company and the general counsel. So number one, protecting information is important to them. And it's important to them, A, because it's a hostile environment, but it's also important to the board. I mean, they're getting questions on a regular basis. So getting back to, so what do you communicate to the board? I mean, the board doesn't want to understand, I had some noise today. I mean, they want to understand significant issues. So if there's something really significant that is going to make the press, that you feel might make the press, then the board probably needs to know about it. And you have to have a process in place to get to the board. Did that help any more? Okay. Any other questions? Well, I'll be here the rest of the day, so please feel free to catch me in the hall. I think there's going to be a copy of the presentation up on the ISSA website. It has my contact information. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.